Every room in this house has different footprint designs not constructed by one person. 3 sections of this house, the construction material used predate 1900 by decades. In each section of this house, the residual and real-time paranormal encounters are different. But then there are encounters by the same spirits throughout the house as a whole. These differences have everything to do with historical events that took place in each section and events that took place in this house as a whole. In order to explain these encounters, we must know the history of each section and the history as a whole. In order to understand and explain these encounters with spirits, we must know the history of those who set these events in motion and what took place in this house that caused some of these spirits to haunt the living. There are things these spirits said I thought was completely off the wall, but after doing historical research, I now believe what these spirits say is true. Of all the videos ever released, this video is the most important video to watch from beginning to end. Now the pieces of the puzzle will be put in place, and you will now understand what took place that caused these powerful paranormal encounters. By 1900, the Lamb House sat to the right of what's known as the Grange Building. To the left of the Lamb House was the F. Murphy House. The Slaughterhouse was to the right of the Murphy House. Behind the Lamb House was Dr. John Benjamin's residence. Dr. Benjamin also practiced medical treatment from his residence. The Lamb House has an unusual history. As we know, in 1875, based on the map, the lot where this house sits today, the house didn't exist. Next to the Grange Building, you can now see the front of the Lamb House. Edmund Lamb was born in Carmel on September 11, 1864. As a young adult, he moved to Bangor and was trained in the undertaking business. Edmund married Hattie Elmira Philbrook on July 10, 1886. Edmund was 22, Hattie was 18. In 1896, Edmund moves his family to Carmel, where he was born. When Edmund moved his family to Carmel, they lived in this house on Highway 69. It's possible this is Hattie in the picture, but we're not 100% certain. There's a date on the photo, 1920 to 1940. We'll get back to this later. Edmund opened a horse harness shop in the village of Carmel. His home, also located in the village, was a 2-minute walk from his store. In 1896, Edmund was licensed with the Board of Health. His undertaking business was listed as E.L. Lamb, Undertaker. As undertaker, Edmund built the caskets and prepared the dead for burial. Today, this title is known as a mortician or funeral director. Edmund operated his business outside the horse harness shop. During this time period, around 1896, wakes and funeral services were held in the family's home. However, family home wakes and services were becoming a thing of the past. Funeral parlors, known as funeral homes today, were becoming more popular. Family preferred their loved ones to be taken to a funeral parlor to be prepared for burial and wakes held. It was bad enough someone lost their loved one, but for their loved one to be embalmed and prepared for burial in the family home, and visitors coming in the home for a 3-day wake, this added to the pain of losing a loved one. They preferred an undertaker handle all the arrangements outside the home. But due to the growing demand for funeral parlors, Edmund had to do something to stay up with the changing demand. We're guesstimating Edmund purchased this lot around 1899 where he would open the funeral parlor. When this funeral parlor was designed, the concrete basement was constructed to specific specifications. For in this basement is where Edmund prepared the dead for burial. We believe, based on extensive research, Edmund purchased a small 1-room schoolhouse from the Carmel School District. It's likely this schoolhouse was located on Irish Road and moved to this location. After carefully observing this structure, this is what the original design looked like. When Edmund's funeral parlor first opened, this was a 2-room facility, the basement being the prep room, the upstairs living room, where the 3-day wakes and visitations would take place. In this photo, you can see the porch roof attached to the right of the upstairs window, and there are only 2 porch pillars at the front. Later, this porch structure would change. What we call the witch's window room and dining room section of this house, this section was moved and attached to the front section of the house. We don't know the exact date this happened, but where did this structure come from? After doing more extensive research, we believe it's likely this structure belonged to Dr. John Benjamin. Dr. Benjamin's house where he practiced from was located directly behind the Lamb House. At some point, these buildings were removed, and an addition was added onto the main building. This became the Freemason Lodge. We believe Edmund moved this structure and attached a structure to the funeral parlor. If this structure is in fact a former structure Dr. Benjamin owned, and if it's possible this was Dr. Benjamin's infirmary for the sick and dying, if this is the case, this would answer why the paranormal activity in this portion of the Lamb House is different from the activity captured in the front section of the house. Every time I go up into the witch's window room, I can't breathe. The activity captured in this room suggests multiple people died in this room at one time. And this is the section of the house where we heard the disembodied cry of a baby. Also in the upstairs, spirits always bring up a child. How did the child die? We named this room the Witch's Window Room based on urban legend. People installed a sideways windows to keep witches from flying into their house. I really didn't believe that legend, and I didn't believe that's why this window was installed sideways. However, there is another legend that's more believable. Windows were installed this way so when someone passed away in the room, due to the winding narrow stairs, the body of the deceased can be removed out this window in a wooden box. If this is a true legend, and if this was Dr. Benjamin's infirmary, that would explain why this window was installed sideways. This stairway design makes it almost impossible to move furniture up to the upstairs. I believe this is a more plausible explanation of why this window's in sideways. A smaller window could have been installed, but this design makes more sense. The kitchen section of this house was added at a much later date. We will get into this later. There is something I notice about the garage. The materials used to build this garage is much older than the date Edmund opened the funeral parlor. I couldn't explain how this was possible. These materials date back to the early 1800s. I assume when Edmund moved the front structure of the house to this location, he also built the garage at this same time, but this was not the case. If this building dates back to the early 1800s and Edmund moved this building to this location, where did this building come from? After doing extensive research, we learn it's highly probable Edmund purchased this structure from the Carmel School District as well. This garage may have been the former Ash Hill School, and Edmund converted this building into the barn. I did look at the structure carefully. The wall framing does have multiple nail holes on each stud, indicating at one time this room had closed-in walls, and these walls were removed. This garage in the old picture of the Ash Hill schoolhouse is an exact match. The back of the garage was the front of the schoolhouse. Old coat hooks were found packed away in the upstairs. When the mudroom was constructed, these old coat hooks were used in this room. We speculated Edmund may have stored bodies in the upstairs garage due to the fact no known winter vault existed. But I later found out there was in fact a winter vault. I located this vault hidden in the back corner of Highland Cemetery. When I looked at this vault carefully, I found something very interesting. The construction of this vault had the same construction footprint as the basement of the Lamb House. The construction designs are an exact match. I later find out the person who constructed this vault is the same person who built the basement for Edmund. And this person was also a former casket maker for Carmel until Edmund became the Undertaker. Also, he is the grandfather to the person who was the grandson to Edith Wheeler. Edith Wheeler was the girl who lived next door to the Mitchells, Naomi Mitchell's friend who Naomi asked if she could walk to the store with her on the day she was murdered. Let's go back to the basement of the Lamb House. This basement was designed to be the prep room Edmund used to prepare the dead for burial. Concrete was used instead of rock. This was designed not only to keep the basement a cooler environment, but for sanitary purposes as well. In most all basements in Maine, during this time, the floors in the basement were dirt. However, this basement was designed with a concrete floor. Around the floors at the walls, wash grooves were designed. These wash grooves led to a drain over in the corner. This was designed for sanitary purposes. But you may ask, wasn't this designed like this due to the water issues? After all, water goes under the house and pours into the basement. However, this house never had these water issues until recent years. These water issues started when the parking lot was built up at the Freemason Lodge a few years back. A question I always asked, what was this structure? We poorly speculated maybe this was Edmund's crematory. However, cremations were not popular back in the days when Edmund was the Undertaker. But I later learned this was likely a body vault Edmund used when preparing the dead for burial. He would store them in this vault. Back in those days, refrigerations didn't exist. The funeral parlor would need something to hold the dead before preparing for burial. This structure was designed with thick concrete, enabling a cool environment. I noticed something about the structure. This looked to have a design at one time. There may have been a door to the front of this structure. This was based on the steel strap, and this section may have been designed for door hinges. When I saw the construction of the winter vault door, I believe this vault and the smaller vault in the basement had the same design. At some point, the top and the door was removed from this vault. When I opened this sealed window to inspect the construction, I found an old piece of steel sitting on the ground. It turned out this was a hinge that went to the door of this vault. The design of this hinge has the same footprint design as the door hinge on the winter vault. Many months ago, I went to the upstairs garage to inspect the old windows sitting in the back corner. While looking at these windows, I cleaned up the garage to make more room to film these investigations. It turned out these are the original windows to the front section of the house. Since the beginning of these investigations, we knew some of Edmund's belongings were left in this garage. But I never before pulled out these old windows sitting in the corner. When I pulled these windows out, I found an old baby playpen and an old baby crib. Behind the playpen, I found what looked like old blankets and curtains. I pulled this material out, and to my surprise, it turned out these were Edmund's old funeral drapes, casket table covers, and a casket cover. This was an amazing discovery. I finally was able to touch a piece of history that has ties to the Lamb House being a funeral parlor. I go online and look up old funeral drapes and confirm these are vintage funeral curtains. It's possible this curtain with the chain going through it was for Edmund's wagon hearse. Laying on the floor face down, I noticed a long board that had wood trim around it. I pulled all the junk off the board, turned it over. What I saw completely took my breath away. This was the E.L. Lamb sign that was likely attached to the front of the house. Edmund's undertaking business was licensed as E.L. Lamb. This is not the same sign that was once attached to Edmund's storefront. This sign was designed to be attached flat on the front of a building. In 1919, Edmund sells the undertaking business to Harold Harvey. I want to go back to this picture. The first name in this picture is Ed Lamb. There's no doubt Edmund lived in this house when he moved back to Carmel with his family. All records verify this was the case. In 1920, Willis and Ella Hughes purchases the house from Edmund. And in 1940, Howard Hasey takes over ownership of the house, and the house becomes known as the Howard Hasey House. When Edmund sold this house in 1920, by then his daughter and son are grown up and gone. I believe Edmund fixed up the Lamb house to reside in. All the construction evidence show the upstairs bedroom at one time was in fact an attic. The material used to construct the bedroom walls and the ceiling are much newer than the structure itself. The subfloor structure was installed. At a later date, other floor coverings was installed on the original floor. This stairway did not exist until the bedroom was constructed. There's no doubt based on the construction evidence, these walls were also added at a later date. I believe Edmund made a lift to lower the bodies into the basement here. After the stairs were added in, a door was installed here. And these stairs were added to the basement. Modern sheetrock was used in this section in front of the basement door. There is solid evidence this opening was reconstructed from the original design. In order to make this house livable, sometime in the 1920s, Edmund added the kitchen. However, there is no bathroom. An outhouse was used. To my surprise, this house never had a full bathroom until 1997. There was a toilet under the witch's window room stairs, but that's all there was. No sink or shower. After learning about the history of this house, this answered a lot of questions I had. How was Rachel buried under the kitchen? If Rachel died before 1920, there was no kitchen when she was buried. She would have been buried outside the house just a few feet away from the structure.
Female.
Where's the female buried at? As you have seen in these Ghost Chronicles series, multiple times these spirits and Rachel said she was in the basement, buried under the house. Through many investigations, we determined Rachel was under the kitchen.
Did you or anybody know what happened to Rachel's body after she died? Did Did you say you're buried under the kitchen?
At one point, I went under the house close to the refrigerator and kitchen window. This is what Rachel said during the spirit box session while I was under the house. These ghosts are telling the truth and she is buried under here. I'm wondering if it'd be right in this area. Hello?
I'm by the kitchen window. I wonder if this could be it.
It's hollow. Other strange activity kept pointing us into the direction exactly where Rachel was buried. My daughter-in-law was visiting. I was sitting at the dinner table talking with my son. She walks into the kitchen. I look over at her as she's getting ready to sit down in the chair when suddenly out of nowhere, her hair stood up. My son and I jump from the table in shock. We grab our cameras, but by the time we start recording, most of her hair settled back down. Where this took place in the kitchen is the exact location under the floor spirits say Rachel is buried. After these spirits and Rachel told me where she was buried, when I made the decision I was going to go under the house to search for Rachel, these spirits had one thing to say about this. Is Rachel down here? Rachel, if you're down here, a few months ago you told me I'm right on the spot. You told me I found you. Can you guys verify to me that Rachel's here? So I'm going to start digging right here. Now, if Rachel is buried right here in this spot, more than likely what happened, she was buried here before Edmund built this addition on. This is right under the kitchen. I'm under the kitchen window right here. Hello?
Rachel. You guys, is this the spot? Oh, this ground's really, really, really soft. Am I getting close to Rachel? For now, I'm going to wrap this up and go check out the fragments that I got. Look at them closely. Okay, I was digging in the basement and I found these bone fragments by where the kitchen window is, under the kitchen. Did I find bone fragments that belong to Rachel? Many bone fragments have washed up on the basement floor. Other spirits also claim they too were buried in this basement. Bone fragments found as strong physical evidence there is truth behind what these spirits say. But why would Edmund bury remains on this property? What was he involved in? He was a Freemason, but there is no evidence to suggest Freemasons would do anything like this. After doing even more extensive research into Edmund, I saw another secret society he belonged to besides the Freemasons. This secret society is known as the IOOF. I didn't know what the IOOF stood for, so I looked it up. IOOF stands for the Independent Order of Oddfellows. What I found completely, 100% unequivocally blew me away. The Oddfellows use actual human remains for rituals, facing their own mortality. And it is known some also kept human skulls in their homes. All over the United States, human remains have been found hidden in old Oddfellow lodges that closed down. I spoke with the Grand Master of the Oddfellows. He did in fact confirm to this day they use real human remains for their rituals, and some do in fact keep human skulls. I asked where these human remains come from. He said they come from a medical supply company from India. Then I asked, in the 1800s to early 1900s, where would the Oddfellows obtain human remains? Again, he said a supply company from India. I proceeded to tell him, based on many news articles, this was not always the case. At one of the former Oddfellow lodges, the skeletal remains found, a medical examiner determined these remains at one time were buried, and likely this was the results of a grave robbery. Other remains found were also questionable. The conversation abruptly ended. It is a fact real human remains are used by the Oddfellows. This takes me back to Edmund Lamb and his association with the Oddfellows. As an undertaker, Edmund had access to human remains. I don't want to get tied up into a bunch of conspiracy theories involving the Oddfellows, but multiple times these spirits say Edmund hid them. Edmund hid Abby's head. Bone fragments have been found, and these spirits are angry. They want these bone fragments back. There is physical evidence what these spirits say is true. There is historical facts what these spirits say is true. I personally believe these spirits are telling us the truth. But then I received even more compelling information. The Carmel chapter of the Oddfellows rented a building in the village of Carmel to hold their meetings. Where? At the Grange building right next door to the Lamb House. This information was verified and confirmed. This brings up a valid question. Did Edmund store remains in this body vault that were used during these rituals? Here is another valid question. The Oddfellows held their meetings in the Grange building, but is it possible when they performed their death rituals using human remains,
Were these rituals held in the Lamb House? Is it possible Rachel's remains were used in these rituals as well as others? Is this how Rachel ended up buried on this property? I set up the funeral drapes and put together a makeshift casket to use as trigger objects. I've found the Lamb House doesn't need trigger objects to get these spirits to respond, but maybe these funeral drapes and the E.L. Lamb sign will jog some memories. These drapes had a lot of dust and mouse droppings on them from sitting in the garage for 100 plus years. I set this up in the garage, not inside the house due to the unsanitary conditions. Other paranormal investigators come to the garage when I conduct the EVP and spirit box session. I have particular questions I hope to get answers. When the EVP session starts, spirits immediately respond. Everyone in the garage will clearly hear disembodied voices. In real time, we will hear these voices much more clearer than what the recording device has picked up. There are multiple recording devices set up. I will use what device captured the clearest response. You guys up here tonight? You guys up here tonight? Edmund. Somebody voice. Edmund. Somebody voice. Edmund. Hattie. You guys led me to Abby's head. You guys led me to Abby's head. Did you take Abby's head, Edmund? Are you back in this corner?
I heard that.
This is disembodied voice.
Over here, yeah.
Are you back in this corner? Are you back in this corner?
I heard that.
This is disembodied voice.
Over here, yeah.
It was bent over there.
Who's responsible for Abby's head being taken? Edmund, did you put Abby's head in this house?
Does that mean yes, Edmund? The garage seems fairly active. We're hearing the disembodied voices, the EMF meter, REM pod, and temperature deviation devices are all responding as well. I quickly start the spirit box session. I need confirmation to questions I've been pondering about Rachel, Edmund, and the death rituals Edmund practiced.
Edmund, I have a question for you. After all the dead bodies that you saw as the Undertaker, and you saw many of them, did this terrify you? Did death terrify you? Were you petrified of death? Since coming to an understanding what took place in this house, asking spirits questions to verify the information gathered, some spirits are warning us to leave. Another spirit warns us the house is not safe. What did you say?
Not safe.
Not safe. What was clearly captured on another camera before the spirit said, "Not safe here," this will verify what we already know. But when a spirit verifies what you know, this is extremely terrifying. I will now ask Edmund if he got involved with the Oddfellows due to his fear of death. Did you get involved with the Oddfellows because you were petrified of death? Edmund, or if anybody else can answer this, did you hold on to Rachel's remains? Without a doubt, this is Rachel's voice. Everyone in the room clearly heard her voice say yes. Did you hold on to Rachel's remains and use her remains during rituals when you were an Oddfellow? Because we heard Rachel's voice, I will directly ask Rachel the same question. Rachel, did Edmund hold on to your remains to practice, to do rituals with when he was an Oddfellow? He did. That was Rachel.
Absolutely, that was Rachel.
I'm going to shut off the spirit box and only run the ghost box. Again, I will ask the same question. Did Edmund use Rachel's remains to perform rituals when he was an Oddfellow? Then a spirit says something, a topic that I didn't want to get into. Why do they want blood for the portal? voice behind me. Why do they want blood for the portal? In most all cases, paranormal investigators investigate haunted locations in hopes spirits will communicate with them. They want to understand who or what is haunting the location. However, in this house, spirits seek out the living. These spirits want the living to understand who or what they are. But for the first 3 years living in this house, I shut them out. I could not explain what was going on in this house, nor did I want to find an explanation. I refused to believe in ghosts. I shut the activity out of my mind. What was going on in this house were just strange coincidences. Family members and former residents believe these strange coincidences are the results of the house being haunted. But for 3 years these spirits watched me. They observed my conversations, my beliefs. It's possible they thought I would listen, but how to get me to listen? Rachel was determined to shake the skepticism right out of me. The night she tapped on my hip and with a loud, soft voice said, "Help me, Kent," she did succeed in getting my attention. I didn't know who she was or what happened to her. Why was she needing help? After learning the full circumstances of her situation, I understood why she was asking for help. What I didn't understand, why did this happen to Rachel? How could this be explained? Based on what these spirits said and the circumstances behind her death and burial, this all seemed a little far-fetched. Things like this just didn't happen during Rachel's time era. But did these things happen? After doing a little research, I learned what happened to Rachel is not so far-fetched. In 1977, a lady by the name of Nettie Mitchell, no relations to the Mitchells here in Carmel, was talking to a film producer, David Hoffman, about her personal knowledge that she had of a young girl in the 1800s that was shipped off to a factory by her parents to work. She was only 13 years old. While working at this factory, Emmeline's boss ended up getting her pregnant. After Emmeline gave birth to the baby was given over to another family, and the pregnancy was covered up. Emmeline was sent home. Sometime later, Emmeline's family found out about the pregnancy, that Emmeline had a baby out of wedlock. Emmeline was ostracized by her family. She was ostracized by everyone in the community. She was looked down upon for having a baby out of wedlock. Emmeline was just an innocent girl that was more than likely raped, but yet she had to pay the price and was ostracized by society. That's the way society was back in the 1800s, even into the early 1900s. If a female ended up pregnant out of wedlock, she was ostracized. She was a cast out. As time went by, Emmeline spent the rest of her life alone, a cast out. Many years went by and a major storm hit the state of Maine. Emmeline was stuck in her home and couldn't get out to get anything to eat. Nobody would check on her. Essentially, she starved to death. That's how much of an outcast she was. And Emmeline's story is not the only story. There are many other examples of females that ended up pregnant out of wedlock that were ostracized by society. They were complete cast-outs. Not only were they rejected by society, but their names, their history was completely wiped off the record. Film producer David Hoffman found it was a little hard to believe Nettie Mitchell's story. But after doing extensive research, they came across another lady who also knew Emmeline and what took place. However, Mr. Hoffman and his team of researchers could find no history of Emmeline from the town of Fayette. It's as if Emmeline was erased from history and forgotten about. Eventually, the research team came across a diary found at a library. Within this diary, they did find Emmeline did in fact exist, but there were no burial records kept. Emmeline was not permitted to be buried in the cemetery. Nobody knows where Emmeline was buried. In the 1800s into the mid-1900s, any female who was pregnant out of wedlock was ostracized and rejected by society. Based on accounts, we know Rachel was pregnant out of wedlock. Even if Rachel's pregnancy was the result of rape, this did not matter to society. She was rejected. She was an outcast. Somebody could have murdered Rachel and claimed it was suicide. Nobody would care enough to look into it. And it's likely nobody would have claimed her body. Like Emmeline, Rachel was erased from history, removed from society. What Edmund was involved in, he could have kept Rachel's remains, and nobody would have even asked questions about it. There is no doubt. Rachel was ostracized. Nobody even cared enough to find out what really happened to her. Nobody cared enough to know whether she got a proper burial. She was a perfect target to be used under the circumstances the way she was used. Nobody questioned it. Nobody would care. And that's why Rachel was seeking help from the living. She wanted somebody to know her story. She wanted somebody to understand what really happened to her. And once we understood what happened, once we fully grasped the situation, Rachel finally let go. She may have been ostracized back then, but she is not ostracized by the living today. It's time to fit the pieces of the puzzle together. The encounters of Rachel started these investigations. She is the center of what took place in this house. Rachel committing suicide was the information passed down to the Mitchell descendants. However, Rachel and other spirits gave a different account.
Well, all I know is that we thought that she had committed suicide. We had died in an old funeral home in Carmel, Maine.
How did you die? Since the very beginning, Rachel was seeking help. Rachel? For years during investigations, spirits were trying to tell us where Rachel's remains were located. Did you say you're buried under the kitchen? Are you buried in this basement? Rachel confirms she wants me to find her. Rachel, do you want me to find your body?
Rachel buried down here? I need a yes or no answer. From multiple comments spirits have made over the years, I believe Rachel's remains were kept and used during death rituals. I believe Edmund tried to preserve Rachel's remains, but her body decomposed and caused an odor people could smell. Her remains were hidden, buried in the yard next to the house. And it is possible Rachel wasn't alone. Other remains were buried as well. Did you hide Rachel down here?
Female.
Where's the female buried at?
Loud.
I believe Rachel was desperate for me to find her remains. However, something sinister did not want me to find her. I'm going to come down here looking for Rachel. After I located Rachel's remains, the activity in the house changed. It turned dark. Entities were angry. I know what you are. Seriously? Does this mean you're not going to answer my... Whoa! Whoa! I have no doubt demonic entities were angry at me for collecting bone fragments. These entities wanted these bone fragments left in place. However, human spirits were angry their remains were defiled by others and wanted their remains returned. Are these bone fragments belong to any of you? Then there's the matter of Abby's head. I learned there were in fact Oddfellow members who kept human skulls. What they used these skulls for is unknown.
What about Abby?
skeletal remains have been found beneath floorboards in old Oddfellow lodges. One example, 1976, St. Clair, Pennsylvania. I believe Abby's head was hidden beneath the upstairs floor before new floorboards were installed. To get to this skull, I would have to tear up the new floor coverings. It's next to impossible to reach what was found under the floor. Because there is no way to prove Rachel was raped or murdered, or any of these other spirits faced the same fate, I'm not going to make any claims this did happen. We can only go by what these spirits say. But Rachel, Abby, and others, there is physical and historical evidence what they say about their remains can be verified today. The Oddfellows obtaining human remains and using these remains during rituals is no conspiracy theory. This is a fact. Collecting human skulls is also a fact. What I found very compelling, Edmund had full access to human remains. These facts are what convince me what these spirits say is true. But why would Edmund, who was considered to be an upstanding citizen, a man of great character, be involved with all this? And by the way, to be a member of the Oddfellows in those days, you had to be an upstanding citizen in your community. Edmund was also a member of the John R. Chase Order of the Eastern Star. Charles A. Chase was the Grand Master of the local chapter of the Oddfellows. Edmund and Charles Chase had a deep personal connection. This connection was so close, Edmund, Charles, and their two wives were buried in the same plot together. They even shared the same headstone. On the other side of this headstone are the names of Edmund and Hattie. This shows me Edmund had a close connection to the Grand Master of the Oddfellows. Again, I ask, why was Edmund so deeply involved with all this? I had a theory why, during the investigation in the garage, I asked Edmund if he was terrified of death. Was he petrified of death? Both times the male voice responded, yes. I did research into the psychological traumas funeral directors experience in modern days. It's not uncommon funeral directors suffered from PTSD and funeral fatigue. Not only do they have to prepare the dead for burial, they also experience the family's grief of losing a loved one. They feel the effects of death and the sorrows involving death. They also know one day the roles will be reversed when they become the dead. I do have my own experience in this. When I was in the medical field, saving lives felt rewarding, but encounters of death face to face could be traumatic. There were many deaths I encountered that troubled me. The circumstances behind the death, the shocking pain on the family's face. I didn't know the person who died, but their eyes opened looking at me with such an empty look. The sorrows I felt for this person and their family was in fact traumatic. But something else also troubled me. This thought I had to shut out of my mind. I knew one day I will face the same demise. In a lot of ways I found death extremely troubling, painful, and at times terrifying. From experience, this is why I asked Edmund that question, did death terrify you? His answer, yes. I could relate to this. But in my case, I wasn't cut out to be in the medical field facing death. Many times I would go home, bury my face in a pillow, and cry, grieving for the person I never knew that just died. The pain and the sorrows I felt for the family was sometimes too much to bear. I took it personal. I had to get out of the medical field. I had to shut all of these experiences out of my mind and move on with life and not dwell on death. But in Edmund's case, death was on an even more personal level. He was the undertaker in a small community where everybody knew each other. I believe Edmund faced death on a very personal level. For 21 years, Edmund looked into the faces of those he knew. They laid in front of him, looking back at him with those empty eyes. He prepared them for burial. He buried them in the ground, never to be seen again. Their remains laying in total darkness. I have no doubt Edmund suffered from PTSD. I also believe Edmund became petrified of his own demise. He knew one day he would face the same fate as those he buried in the ground. For this reason, he was a member of the Oddfellows. He would go into a dark, candlelit room, stand next to the remains of the dead, and partook in rituals facing his own mortality. But under the circumstances, Edmund's trauma over his own demise, and the PTSD he suffered from, may have caused Edmund to cross lines normal people wouldn't cross. If what these spirits say is true about Edmund, I don't justify his actions. I can only put myself in his shoes to understand his actions. Based on what these spirits say, and based on the evil encounters in this basement, what Edmund got involved in turned very dark. This opened a dark portal leading into the underworld of demonic entities. These entities crave death. And I have no doubt, this being Edmund's prep room for the dead, there was in fact blood spilled on this basement floor. The blood giving strength to this dark portal. This is why spirits said the house is evil. These investigations woke up that sleeping bear in the basement. But I can tell you, this gets much, much deeper. And these spirits reveal just how deep this gets.